Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Room for Discussion. As glaciers melt, sea levels rise, and forests burn, the physical effects of climate change are impossible to ignore. But the impacts go beyond the environment. They're reshaping our economy in ways we're just beginning to understand.
In his latest book, Dr. Jisung Park elaborates on the details of these factors, from educational attainment to rising crime rates and worker productivity, all being impacted by rising temperatures.
Today, we'll dive into these hidden costs, exploring how vulnerable workers and communities are bearing the brunt of this crisis and what we can do to protect them. What can policymakers, businesses, and individuals do to mitigate these effects and build a more resilient future?
On that note, please welcome Dr. R. Jisung Park to our stage.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Have a seat. So, you've carved a bit of a niche out of here at the intersection of labor economics and climate change.
Yeah.
Your research highlights the impact of environmental factors on economic opportunity. What initially drew you to this line of research?
Yeah, thanks for the question. But before that, let me just start by saying thanks to both of you and the rest of Room for Discussion for hosting this, and everyone for being here. What a great space on this beautiful day, which I'm told is a rarity in Amsterdam. To answer your question, how did I get into this space? I guess the shortest way to answer it is by saying that I grew up very much a child of the outdoors. I was very much a lover of nature. And when I was in your shoes in college as a university student, I thought I wanted to work in environmental policy. And at the time, climate change was only beginning to emerge as a potential major threat. And even then, the majority of sort of both public discussion and even academic discussion of the issue was focusing primarily on what climate change would do to ecosystems, right, and environmental degradation, which is obviously something that I care a lot about. But as I did my coursework in economics and other fields, I began to, develop a deeper appreciation of the possibility that climate change could also have damaging effects on, as you mentioned at the outset, many facets of our economy. And as I went on to do more work in the policy space and then to get a PhD in economics, it became clear that both from a sort of public information and messaging perspective and from a policy-making perspective, it would be important to, as clearly as possible, identify and articulate what are the potential effects of climate change on our economy. And so naturally, I gravitated toward the tools that we had at our disposal. And we'll talk about this later. This was at the time that economics as a profession was beginning to use more and more data in our research, more real-world data, and real-world data from student test scores, from worker productivity and workplace accidents. These were kinds of things that I thought could help us better understand these issues. So, the long-winded way of saying it both grew out of a desire to help inform environmental policy broadly and an opportunism, I guess, in terms of what kinds of data and methods were available as a researcher.
Do you think this kind of historical focus on the ecological rather than the economic might have been somewhat detrimental in creating action on this?
It's hard to say. I think I see where you're coming from. On the one hand, to the extent, I don't know what the political situation is like, or the public kind of messaging has been like in the Netherlands, but certainly in the U.S., some people like to joke that Al Gore was both a blessing and a curse for climate change because, on the one hand, he brought so much attention to the issue, but on the other hand, in the U.S. at least, it became even more politicized as an issue, in part because I think is framed in a particular language. And I'll be careful with my words here. I don't think that was detrimental on net. I think it was very helpful, but certainly to the extent that if you pitch action on climate change as motivated only by one's love for or passion for protecting polar bears or coral reefs or other ecosystems, that may resonate with some. It certainly resonates personally with me. But if you're, from a political science perspective, it may have the potential of limiting the space or the tent under which there might be more consensus around the policy issues. So the fact of the matter is that it affects way more than obviously just the ecosystems. We can talk about that.
On that question of different ways of thinking about the environment, you begin your book Slow Burn by contrasting two historical disasters, right?
Yeah.
The eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the fall of Rome illustrate the different ways we as a public think about climate change. Could you elaborate on that analogy for us and our audience?
Yeah, sure. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of Mount Vesuvius, right? Instant eruption, and a whole city was erased by this ecological calamity. That's more similar, right, to the popular narrative around climate change that I think we're accustomed to, which is as a form of potential civilization-ending kind of collapse, right? We even, in many countries, we stopped using the term climate change and replaced it with the term climate catastrophe or climate disaster. So that's one way of thinking about climate change. I'm contrasting that to the fall of Rome, which, if you ask many historians, I'm not a historian, based on what I've read, was actually a much more gradual affair, right? That spread out across many decades, if not centuries. And both the causes and the consequences of the fall of Rome were much more subtle and what I would call slow burning, right? Standard of living falling gradually, right? Trade networks crumbling gradually over time, right? The sheer sort of strength and might of the empire beginning to wane. And in many ways, at least based on the data that I'm familiar with, the way climate change will affect society as a whole is much more similar to the latter than the former, right? In two dimensions. One, there's very little evidence that it will be some, one stroke completely annihilating, humanity or civilization. It'll be much more gradual. And two, the evidence, at least again that I'm familiar with, suggests that yes, we should worry about ensuring against the potential for complete global and civilizational collapse. That's certainly a risk that you want to insure against. But the more probable scenario seems to be one in which climate change results in a steady decline in quality of life for the billions of people on this planet. So that was really the distinction I wanted to draw. Again, not to say that thinking about climate change or acting on climate change as a form of what I call planetary catastrophe insurance is not a good idea. That's a very good idea to do. We take out insurance on all kinds of low probability, high pain events all the time, right? But also to suggest that, if we're serious about this issue, we should think of it not only in terms of planetary sort of insurance, but also in terms of, look, what will it do to our quality of life and also to the lives and livelihoods of those much less advantaged than us? And what does that entail in terms of what we're prepared to do to reduce that effect, both by reducing our emissions and also by adapting to climate change? So it's really the slow burn perspective kind of asks us to take a much less kind of catastrophic view and a much more pragmatic view, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you often discuss bridging this gap between the extreme narratives on action. You start your book by quoting both Greta Thunberg and Björn Lomborg as kind of different perspectives. How does focusing on present-day impacts, like reduced labor productivity, help in creating a more actionable narrative on climate change?
Well, we'll see if it does. That's certainly the hypothesis, one of the hypotheses behind the book. I mean, look, I was being a little bit coy when I, led with quotes with both Greta Thunberg and Björn Lomborg, but they do kind of encapsulate two sides of this very extreme divide, right? One sort of, look, this is the end of the world. We shouldn't even be in school. We should all be very furious and panicking. And another sort of, this is not a big deal at all relative to other problems. I think I'm not the only economist to point out that if you look at the data, there are many reasons to suspect that the costs to the economy that climate change is already incurring and will continue to incur over time outweighs the costs of acting to mitigate emissions. So we can talk about, the social cost of carbon and what that number represents and how we, what research goes into creating that number. But I guess the simple way to answer your question is that I just wanted to, again, draw a little bit of a distinction from this very hyperpolarized, politicized, emotional way of thinking about climate change and really try to focus on, okay, well, what does the data tell us about the magnitude of the problem? And not, before we infuse it with so much moral and ethical significance, which we have the right to do, to at least be clear about what the facts are on the ground in terms of the sort of the quantitative burden of climate change, if you will, which is not an easy thing to quantify. It certainly has its risks in trying to attempt something like that. But I guess my starting point as an economist is let's get all the numbers on the table and then let's figure out what they mean, both morally and ethically, and then policy-wise, et cetera.
Well, one of these risks of looking at the present is, of course, the present bias that leads us to prioritize these kind of short-term gains over long-term risk.
Sure.
I mean, it makes inaction not only costly, but exponentially so over time.
Yes.
How can we internalize these escalating costs in economic or policy frameworks in order to drive an effective mitigation strategy?
Yeah, so your question is about present bias, and there's sort of two subtle dimensions to that, right? On the one hand, the problem of climate change is fundamentally a problem of, intergenerational welfare, right? It's most of the most severe damages of climate change will be coming many years into the future. The costs of doing something about it are borne for the most part today, right? We're all familiar with this sort of temporal dimension of the problem. So one practical, I guess, one practical dimension of trying to underline or bring more attention to these, let's call them slow burning effects of climate change, is to pull that forward, to say, look, not only already are days in the 90, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, what is that, sort of high 20s, low 30s Celsius, these kinds of hot days are already reducing labor productivity around the world. We have evidence to back this up. We can actually measure the effect of, say, a 32 degrees Celsius day on labor productivity in a place like China, right, or India, or even in the US, and quantify that. Of course, and when we quantify that effect is actually already quite large. Of course, the real effect that we're worried about is what happens, in 50 to 100 years, where instead of there being 5 to 10 32-degree days per year, right, in a place like Berlin, Germany, maybe there are 30 to 40 of those days. What does that do to labor productivity in that state of the world? But even that is very much in the far future. And so part of our job, I think, as researchers and academics and policy professionals is to help the public understand that not only are there costs today, but these costs will, without action, be further magnified in the future. But also part of our job is to then we'll make it comparable in terms of, okay, in present value terms, here are the total costs that society will bear from climate change if we don't act. And let's compare that to the costs of acting. And if the costs of not acting are larger, socially speaking, and that's a key distinction, of course, than the costs of acting, then again, yes, there are some sort of ethical and moral nuances that go into that calculus, but just from a sheer kind of economic perspective, if the present value damages from not doing anything about climate change are as large as the numbers now are telling us they are, then that's sort of, to me, a overwhelming basis to support aggressively reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that does not have to appeal, for instance, to your personal, desire to save coral reefs or polar bears, which again, I have that inclination, but you may not share it, right? What I'm talking about is the sheer sort of economic burden that we can quantify seems to justify aggressive mitigation. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Well, traditionally, we assess these kind of present values by discounting future costs and events.
sure.
But that whole process is something of a Gordian knot. The right rate is really entangled, and it's very difficult to ascertain what it should be. How does your research on present costs suggest that we should alter these frameworks and alter these models?
Can you say a little bit more behind what your question is asking? I think I understand, but there are multiple dimensions here.
Well, where would you go with it? What do you think is most important?
So first of all, I don't want to pretend that I'm a scholar of discounting because it's a different it's a whole can of worms, and obviously has been a controversial one. That I don't know how far into the weeds we want to get here. The idea of discounting is important, right? Because if you're dealing with a problem like climate change, where so many of the damages from climate change are occurring in the future, if you're discounting that to the present, what discount rate you use obviously matters. If you use a very high discount rate, even if there are massive damages in the future, you don't really care that much because you're very present focused. If you use a very low discount rate, right, which sort of implicitly implies that you care a lot about future generations suffering, right, then that sort of tends to justify a more aggressive action. There's been a long debate among economists that I won't do a great job of summarizing here about what the correct discount rate is. Suffice to say that I think the literature is still in flux, but there seems to be more agreement now than before that a declining discount rate makes sense in the context of uncertainty, which is the world we're in, and also that, if you care about future generations as a social planner, that you probably should use at least a low pure rate of time preference as part of your discount rate, even if your consumption discount rate is high because you think there's going to be high economic growth. I don't know if my research has anything to say directly about the discounting debate. All I will say is that if you believe that climate change has the potential of significantly reducing consumption for many parts of the world, which again is part of the suggestion that my research and others seems to be making now, that you at least want to incorporate that into how you think about discounting in such a way that, right, the state of the world in which acting on climate change turns out to be a good thing is more likely to be a state of the world in which your marginal utility of consumption is high, which would suggest that you would probably want to discount less rather than more.
So beyond these macro level risks, obviously in your book you talk about the hidden costs of climate change. The higher temperatures lead to lower educational attainment, higher crime rates, that sort of thing. What makes these hidden costs in particular so insidious? And how can we isolate heat as a factor in those things?
Sure. So that's two really good questions. One about, I'm going to call subtle versus salient climate risks, and one about methods. So let me start with the former. The book is really trying to draw a distinction between salient climate risks. So here, think about a major hurricane, sea level rise knocking out infrastructure, wildfires, right, like the ones we just saw. I don't know if you remember the Los Angeles wildfires that were so devastating. Let's call those salient climate disasters, climate risks, versus the more subtle climate risks, to which I'm referring to as things like just an increase in the number of moderately hot days in the 80s and 90s Fahrenheit, right, high 20s, low 30s Celsius, or things like wildfire smoke, which very hard to really see, but actually turns out has much more cumulatively damaging effects than we used to know. The book is again trying to emphasize that as important as the salient risks are, the subtle risks, because they accumulate over so many people in ways that are not quite as obvious, seem to be economically meaningful. We can only detect these subtle risks, though, using kind of methods that I talk about in the book, which require quite a bit of data, right? And so here, economists are, including myself, are being opportunistic with sort of the availability of many different data sets, not only the traditional kind of survey-based national income accounts, household accounts, but also what you might refer to as big data, right? Data that is collected for purposes other than the ones that the researchers are using them for. So for instance, in one of the studies that I highlight, we team up with College Board. They're an organization in the US that they help to administer the PSAT and the SAT exams. I don't know what the equivalents are here, but they're sort of like the high school exit college entrance exams. And because you have so many exam records, you can actually link, student test scores to the temperature on the day in which the exam was taken, as well as the temperatures in the preceding months, right? And what we're able to show, and we can talk about any of the details if you're interested in, is that for a given student who experiences a hotter test day relative to a cooler test day, their performance on a given exam seems to be diminished significantly. And again, both the availability of the data, but also the methods that we use to analyze it allow us to arguably make more credible causal claims to say that actually it was in fact hotter temperature that led to lower test scores rather than something else. But that kind of analysis is what allows us to, I think, show with more clarity than before that these subtle risks, which are not as visibly salient, actually add up in meaningful ways. So to give you an example, we have a recent study working with workplace safety data from California, where we have 14 million workers' compensation insurance claims from the state of California. Many of those are from very generic things, like a construction worker falling off of a ladder, right? Or a manufacturing worker getting their hand caught in a machine or spilling a dangerous substance. What we find is that on a day with temperatures, in the high 20s Celsius and the low 30s Celsius, the risk of a worker getting into a workplace accident or suffering an injury increases by anywhere between 5 and 50%, depending on the industry. Some of these accidents are actually visibly heat illness related. So someone actually suffering heat exhaustion, the medical examiner looks at them and says, oh yeah, this is a clear case of heat illness. But most of them actually are things that are ostensibly unrelated to heat. As I mentioned before, it just turns out that you're much more likely as a construction worker to, again, fall off of your scaffolding or get into another kind of accident when the temperature is high, maybe because you're less able to focus, maybe because your concentration is low or your stamina has been affected. But it turns out that because there are just so many more of the latter type of events, the effect of hotter temperature on workplace safety is driven primarily by these more subtle costs. And when you add them up, in a state like California, we estimate that anywhere between 5 and 15,000 additional injuries per year are due to working in hotter temperature environments. And California is not a very hot place to begin with. So that just suggests, to me anyway, that there are many sort of subtle costs from a warmer world that may be missed if you focus only on the very salient disasters that come from climate change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and on this question of data, a lot of these big data sets are provided by government agencies in the US, NOAA, USAID. Do you see an impact already from the kind of slashing of these agencies' budgets and reorganizing of them that will impact climate research now and in the future?
That's a great question. It's still early days, but certainly based on conversations with colleagues, yes. I mean, you see, I have colleagues and collaborators who have had NSF funded projects have their funding completely removed or canceled. There are data sets that researchers access to do this kind of research that is provided by the federal government that have been shut down. So yeah, certainly in the U.S., with the new administration, the research landscape is changing for sure. I hesitate to project out into the future what things will look like. Again, it's still early days, yeah, to answer your question, it certainly has been affected. I mean, you see, you know, um, government agencies, including the EPA, scrubbing terms like climate change from their official correspondences. So that's certainly been, yeah, it's a concerning dimension, certainly as someone who works on this stuff.
I can imagine.
As you got into a little bit, it seems quite apparent that blue-collar work would be affected by rising temperatures, but you also write that white-collar work will be reduced in its productivity.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah.
Can you get into that a little bit? And what are the biggest market risks that we're not anticipating, and what can we do to make those sectors adapt or help them adapt?
Sure. Let me start with the first part, which is about blue-collar workers. As you can imagine, most of the workers who are most exposed to climate risk are those who work in, physically demanding so-called blue-collar occupations. Let me just tell you about the U.S. context first. So within the U.S. labor force, there are roughly 100 million workers who don't have a college degree without a BA. Among those 100 million workers, roughly 70% of them experience routine exposure to harsh environmental conditions on the job. So these are construction workers, transportation workers, highway repairmen, landscapers, etc. These are the types of workers who are, at least according to the data, most likely to be hardest hit, certainly from the effects of hotter temperature, possibly also from the effects of wildfire smoke. I say possibly about white-collar work because the data there is mixed. I mean, obviously, if you believe the results from my own research and others showing that, hotter temperature in places like New York affect students' test scores, then clearly, one suggestion is that in a hot environment without cooling, our cognitive ability, our ability to focus can suffer. I'm sure many of us have experienced this. What that entails for broader productivity, I think it's an open question. I don't think as a research community we've answered it, in part because we're not sitting ducks, right? Human beings, we are adaptive, and if we have the right infrastructure and the resources, we can adapt to many of these effects. The question is, who is able to adapt at what costs and what kinds of supports are necessary to facilitate adaptation? These are questions we don't have answers to. My guess is that the more endowed, the more resource-rich segments of society will be better able to adapt to these risks of climate change. But again, I don't know at what costs.
So climate change, I mean, you spoke about the impact on different groups of people within countries, but I want to expand that a little bit and talk about how climate change disproportionately affects poorer, warmer nations, right? They often lack the resources to adapt.
Yeah.
How can we ensure that these mitigation strategies don't leave these countries behind? Does the global north bear a particular financial responsibility to help with the transition here?
Man, great questions. A lot of dimensions, as with all of your questions. Let me just ask you, though, when you say mitigation, what are you referring to?
If there's a financial burden that needs to be placed upon global north nations like the US or countries in Europe to help countries that are now transitioning, that are more reliant on fossil fuel industries to develop, how does that look like in a financial picture?
Yeah. It's a really complicated question. Let me start with a few facts, right? So you already alluded to this, but as we all know, the vast majority of the emissions that are causing climate change have been put into the atmosphere by richer developed economies, including the US, including the Netherlands, right? The UK, Germany, France. Increasingly, places like South Korea, Japan, China as well. If you look at the projections of what warming will do to both just the physical manifestation of climate change and the potential economic costs of climate change, it looks like poorer countries in the developing world, in the tropics, are likely to be hit much harder. Just to give you an example, right? In a 1.5 degree C warming scenario, which is something that we're almost guaranteed to hit at this point, we're talking about a place like Stockholm adding 2 or 3 days above 32 degrees Celsius per year. A place like Accra or Mumbai in India, we're going to add 100 additional days above 32 degrees Celsius per year, right? So just to give you a sense of the inequality and potential impacts. So there's inequality in the contribution to the problem. There's inequality in both the potential impacts of the problem. Pragmatically, what does that entail in terms of what rich countries should or should not do? I think that's a harder question. My sense as an individual citizen of the world is that certainly to the extent that you believe that, those who have contributed more to the problem have more of a share to bear in terms of the burden of doing something about it, you would imagine, and this is born out of the UNFCCC sort of framework, that richer developed economies bear a larger share of the burden. It's a little bit trickier also because a component of the burden of mitigation involves innovating, right, and reducing the costs of mitigation technologies, which in some sense, richer countries of the world have already paid a larger share too, right? There's research that shows that the cost of solar, which has fallen dramatically over the last 20 years, I think something like cost of solar has fallen by over 80% in the last 15 to 20 years. A lot of that has been driven by policies in countries like Germany, right, which first instituted aggressive feed-in tariffs for solar, which drove down the cost curve. To me, that's already paying a larger share of the burden, right? So if your question is about should that continue, I think the answer is yes. I'm also worried, though, about what the climate change that is already happening, that is already baked into the system, is doing and will continue to do to many developing economies, and what adaptation and resilience looks like in these economies.
Yeah, on one point you bring up the potential for equity weighting in addressing climate change. What would the practical policy approach around that look like? So, and maybe address what equity weighting is in this context as well for our audience.
But you guys keep bringing us into the very technical weeds of the discussion. I'm happy to go in there. I just don't know where. The professor in me is mindful of the audience and wants to know what part of the econ distribution we're drawing from in terms of existing econ background. But the simplest way to explain equity weighting, right, is if you're thinking about climate change as a global social planner, which economists like to do when thinking about costs and benefits, you can treat every individual the same, whether they're rich or poor, or you can treat them differently on the basis of how you as a social planner view the merit, right, of additional resources being given to someone who needs it more versus someone who needs it less. And equity weighting is a way to adjust the social welfare function in a cost-benefit analysis of climate change to account for the fact that as a social planner, you may value, you may give more value to the gains of the Indians and Pakistanis of the world relative to, say, the Swedes and Norwegians of the world on the basis of what the income differential is. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. And I think we should incorporate the audience a little bit as well. So if there are any questions from the audience, we'd love to hear them. Yes, right here in the front.
So I just want to go back to what you were talking about with the hidden costs related to labor productivity. I'm kind of wondering whether there isn't an argument to be made that a part of that is going to be resolved by like evolutionary adaptation, so that as the world gets warmer, for example, new generations are not as impacted with labor productivity because, they adapt in terms of
Yeah, so the question is about whether evolutionarily we will adapt to a warmer climate. I'm not a biologist, but my guess is that there's the answer is, I think, yes, but there's subtleties here. you can imagine many different forms of adaptation. Let's just talk about heat. There are also many different aspects of climate change, of course. Right? But just thinking about hotter temperature, you can think about adaptation in the form of us investing in physical infrastructure. I don't know what the level of air conditioning is in the Netherlands, but I'm going to guess it's quite low because you don't get that much heat here. It's not that warm of a country, not yet anyway. So there are physical investments we can make. There are procedural investments we can make. So if you're a construction firm, you can decide to work during the nighttime as opposed to during the heat of day, which is right what many firms in places like Phoenix, Arizona have to do already, right? Then there's the acclimatization that happens within an individual's lifespan. So you may or may not be aware, but every summer, right, in the beginning, your body is not as accustomed to the heat. Over time, right, there are processes that occur inside your body that make you a little bit better acclimatized to hotter temperature. None of that is evolutionary. What I guess you're referring to is a fourth dimension, right, where over time, if you believe that sort of evolutionary genetic phenomenon still occur in the human population in sort of a survival of the fittest kind of way, that the more heat adapted people will survive better. I don't want to speculate, but my guess is that if I had to choose among those four, the ones that will be most relevant are 1, 2, and 3. But your question, I think, hits at a really important, and I think, you know, for those of you who are interested in research and more further work in this area, a very important and understudied area, which is just the what and the how of and the whom of adaptation, right? How will society adapt to a warmer world? Who within society will be better or worse able to adapt, and what does that imply in terms of the role of government in facilitating adaptation? What kinds of government interventions are most important and effective at facilitating adaptation? I think these are really important questions. And maybe evolution is part of the story, but who knows?
I think we have time for one more question. Gentleman in the front.
Sorry about that. I think a big problem is as well that politicians kind of refuse to communicate these long-term risks, since they are mostly focused on the short-term gains of winning elections. So do you think this is a problem inherent in democracies, and how do you think academics like yourselves could communicate these long-term risks to these politicians who negate the effects of climate change?
That's another great question. How much time do we have?
We got plenty of time.
I think there's absolutely an imperative, not only among academics, but just among civil society and informed citizens to, one, make sure that we are all informed about the long-term risks, and two, that we, let's say, hold politicians accountable, hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard of discussion when it comes to these issues. Just making sure that the premises, the factual premises upon which any discussion happens are both correct and comprehensive. So yeah, I think that that's a role that falls on all of us who have the advantage of having the ability to spend time reading about, discussing about these kinds of issues. I think it falls on all of us. Yeah.
In your book, you argue that climate change is more of a slow-motion economic crisis rather than a singular disaster. Given that kind of framing, how do you think it's possible to address climate change without exacerbating inequality?
How can we address that issue without exacerbating inequality?
Is it possible?
So, okay. Yeah, let me take this one step at a time too. So again, the data suggests that without countervailing interventions, climate change is likely to exacerbate inequality both across countries and within. I hate to say it, but at least in terms of the human sort of health costs of climate change. There are many parts of Europe, I'm going to guess including the Netherlands, although I could be wrong. Certainly places like Sweden and Norway where, at least in the medium term, the benefits of reduced cold-related deaths outweigh the costs of reduced heat or increased heat-related deaths. That is in stark contrast to much of the rest of, well, certainly the tropics, where climate change is expected to increase mortality due to heat, in a very significant way. I guess I'm not sure I understand how the slow-moving part and the inequality part interact in terms of your question, but let me just say that I think it makes it all the more critical that we don't think of the issues in isolation, right? In other words, if you think about, right, both from an international climate negotiation standpoint, and this has always been the case, but also even within a given country, as a country government thinks about how it will respond to the global collective effort to reduce emissions and mitigate climate change by reducing emissions, and also as it thinks about how it will protect its citizens from the warming that is already in store, I think it's crucial to think about the distributional elements, the distributional dimensions of this, thinking about, right, let's take the Netherlands. Who are the workers who are more likely to be affected by climate change sooner, right? What does that entail in terms of potential adaptation responses? Also, if the Netherlands continues to be part of the EU's general response to climate change, which entails, reducing emissions by decarbonizing the energy grid and other aspects of the economy, how will those costs be borne across the income distribution, right? And what can and should be done about it? That is a societal conversation that I think is crucial, especially if you want to make sure that there's that you're able to maintain political support for climate policy over the long haul.
And you argue that there's broad economic consensus on the need for government involvement.
Yes.
But this political will is often lacking or is a little bit fractured. How can governments overcome these barriers to design effective policies?
Man, that's
that are also fair and even sustainable?
That is a great question, and I'm afraid I'm not equipped to answer that one. Frankly, I mean, look, I say this in the book, and I'll say this again here. My read of the literature is that, almost every economist under the sun would probably agree with the premise that a negative externality problem and a global public good problem, which climate change is both of these things, necessitates some form of government intervention. What particular form that takes, is it cap and trade, is it a carbon tax, is it a series of mandates, and how you mobilize the political support for that, much less consensus on those two questions. And I won't pretend to know how to do the third part, because the politics of this issue appear to vary, from context to context in ways that, probably better off asking a political scientist. But my guess is that at the very least, one thing that savvy economics students such as yourselves can continue to do is to remind everyone that even if you are a believer in the power of free markets to lead to a lot of good, which I am very much so, and even the most libertarian of economists would agree with the statement, even Milton Friedman would agree with the statement that if you have a negative externality problem and a public good problem, there is some role for government to play in solving that problem. I think that would be a start.
Maybe a little more specific here, perhaps a little political for your taste, but I think we should get an economist's perspective on this as well. We look at Canada recently, right? The volatility of carbon pricing. The Liberal Party, vocal supporters of this consumer carbon tax, yet Carney on his first day in office reversed course on it. Does this make it politically unstable to be a cornerstone of climate policy? What sorts of lessons do you think we can learn from this?
Again, I must admit I'm not as familiar with the details of Canada's current situation And look, I don't mean to be cynical, but politicians can, depending on the political winds of the moment, use a variety of aspects of a policy to either support it or be against it. There are technical solutions to the problem of price volatility in carbon markets that have been explored in many papers. You could have a hybrid scheme that has price caps and price floors that reduce the level of volatility. And again, as I mentioned, it's one thing to be in support of climate policy on the merits of it and have disagreements about how to implement it. It's another thing to say that, oh, just because the way that we're implementing it now has some drawbacks, we should throw it all out altogether. I think those are different things.
Definitely.
Do you think that, for example, carbon tax is the most effective tool, like they use in Canada, or do you prescribe another policy mechanism?
Yeah, here too. Great question. I'm gonna be disappointing in my answer and give you a very typical economist sort of two-handed answer. I think.
Like the ones that President Truman was so wary of all the time.
Right. I think it really depends. I think it depends on the context. There are pros and cons of a price-based approach, which is the carbon tax that you're referring to, over, say, a quantity-based approach like a cap and trade, or a more mandate-like approach. There, I think it's a careful balancing of both the political constraints that you're operating in and the goals that you have as a regulator. Again, I don't know how far deep into the weeds you want to get, but how should I say this? If I had a magic wand and I could solve many of the political issues associated with any policy prescription, I think a potential strategy would be a aggressive carbon tax that is rising over time, that is consistent with the social cost of carbon, that also involves some kind of rebate, so that like maybe a tax and dividend kind of policy, so that the externality of climate change is internalized, so that all of the segments of society have an incentive to do things that are less carbon polluting, just because it is more economically conducive to do so. But you don't have to have a carbon tax to achieve that.
On more broader consequences for the economy, you see in a lot of places in Florida and California now with the wildfires and the hurricanes, right? The questioning of insurance markets and whether, insurance brokers are not the most idealistic people. They're very, bottom line focused.
Right.
Like, what do you imagine this sort of drive would impact how people think about climate change and the impacts of it? I mean, it's maybe talking about the more salient aspects, but practically speaking, I think it does lend itself to a little more of where people live, how people build their lives. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, as you alluded to, in many parts of the U.S., it's becoming increasingly difficult to get home insurance, especially if you live on the coast or if you live in parts of the West that are prone to wildfire risk. And a lot of this is because insurance companies, I imagine, are one of the most forward-looking and prescient sort of entities when it comes to climate risk, because it affects their bottom line pretty dramatically. Yeah, so increasingly there are homeowners who say, look, I'm not able to renew my insurance without paying 40, 50% more than I used to. And this is really driving decisions. That's a very practical sense in which the damages, the effects of climate change have already arrived on our doorstep, no pun intended. Yeah, I don't remember the second part of your question, but I think that's another example of, again, we're going to need to figure out how to adapt to these risks, and how insurance markets and government regulation around insurance markets either hinder or help the adaptation process. And
yeah, the second part of the question was more, will this sort of reaction push the needle in a more pragmatic way to
Yeah, I
adapt.
think you're already seeing that in many parts, certainly in the U.S. I mean, there's a lot of demand for public responses. It's interesting to speculate about whether this will lead to more people just focusing on the adaptation piece and less on the mitigation piece. My hope would be that by really feeling the pinch of climate change, that all of us become more motivated to act on both fronts, right? To both call for more aggressive transition away from fossil fuels, which is a necessary condition to a stable climate, while also moving to take actions to guard ourselves from the climate change that is inevitable.
Well, a large part of the debate on what policy tools to use and reducing emissions is whether we can actually do that without sacrificing growth. Do we need to get comfortable with ideas like degrowth and post-growth, which have gained a lot of support in the climate debate?
Can you tell me a little bit more about your understanding of the degrowth and post-growth idea? Because I think the answer to that question depends kind of on where you're coming from. Does that make sense?
What do you think is most important? I think there's a lot of discussion that the only way that we would be able to decouple growth from emissions, but there's not a lot of support for such ideas, or a lot of empirical support.
Yeah. So I won't pretend to be an expert on the issue of degrowth or post-growth. I'm aware that it is, an idea that has been brought up. I wish I were more familiar with any empirical literature on this, if there is any. But my guess is that if you think about how much it will cost to decarbonize the economy, and also if you think about let me start over. I find it difficult to believe that a necessary condition of decarbonization is giving up on improving quality of life. I just find that a difficult proposition to believe. And I think if that's what degrowth is emphasizing, then I'm not sure that I buy that. In other words, if you look at history, having a higher standard of living does not necessarily mean that you have to have a more resource-intensive mode of living. And in part, technological progress is about, in part, reducing the resource intensity of achieving a certain standard of living. To the extent that policies have and can continue to reduce the resource intensity of increasing human standard of living, I don't see why you couldn't continue to, increase the life expectancy of the many billions of individuals in poverty currently, to increase educational attainment, to increase, just the quality of life generally, while also doing that just on a more decarbonized energy grid. Of course, there are costs associated with that, but I find it hard to believe that they are a fundamental threat to the idea of achieving human progress, if that makes sense.
Yeah. As we're nearing the end of the hour here, your whole work, I think this hour as well, has shown us and the audience, I hope, you straddle the line between hope and despair a little bit. Yeah. And you really focus on the power of these sorts of narratives that center kind of agency to reach tangible goals in mitigating climate change and adapting to it as well. How can we harness this kind of energy to effectively address these issues, whether on an institutional or a individual level?
Yeah. Let me just start with the individual level. Look, it's easy to believe that we're living through dark times because, in part, the data suggests that we are. But I think there is a very subtle but important difference between wise discernment of reality and cynicism and hopelessness, right? And I think one of the things that at least I try to do is not be afraid to, I guess, look clearly at the severity of an issue, right? But to maintain a certain kind of orientation of optimism in a way. It's not a Pollyannish optimism, but it's just a sense that, look, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I often see, especially among young people, you look at the data, over 45% of survey respondents who are aged 18 to 30 in many developed economies, they report being so anxious about climate change that it affects their daily lives negatively. I guess to me, there's a difference between being concerned about an issue and being motivated to act versus being concerned about an issue and then just allowing that to lead you into an emotional state of despair or hopelessness or nihilism. I think that's the work, that's the kind of emotional work that we all constantly need to do. And my hope is that by adding a little bit more quantitative data to that process, that the hope that you end with is not always just a wishful thinking.
And how do you imagine that translating to an institutional level?
Well, practically, in a well-functioning, liberal democracy, you would imagine that the more individuals who are armed with both the facts and the sort of positive agency about those facts would lead to calls for right action, both on climate mitigation and adaptation, just to stick with this issue, that then is borne out into elected politics.
Well, let's hope that's the case.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us here today. Thank you all for joining us as well. And if you can't get enough of Room for Discussion, well, you're in luck.
On the 31st of March, from 3 to 4 p.m., we'll welcome a variety of student parties at the UvA to discuss all the biggest issue facing us in the academic year.
And on April 1st, from 1 to 2 p.m., Cambridge psychologist Sander van der Linde will join us in talking about the psychology of misinformation. April Fool's Day, perfect day to talk about misinformation and disinformation.
But for now, thank you once again, Dr. Park.
Thank you.
Please join us in giving another round of applause.